Welcome back. This video is going to be about something that has been mentioned uh, about Trump's foreign policy, which is the issue of spheres of influence, and on which even Putin has jumped. Um, and as I myself have been discussing since I was criticizing Biden's wrong priorities on foreign policy, I believe this issue deserves some mentioning, as if only at least to prevent people to keep uh, talking nonsense about spheres of influence, as in the past during the Biden administration they were talking nonsense about red lines. So, number one, Putin is playing with Trump's ambitions in terms of spheres of influence. The best proof of that is his siding with Trump on the issue of taking Greenland. Yes, Putin backed that policy, that idea, that the Trump's idea, but it's not because he believes he has a position about the USA and Greenland. It is to normalize the idea of spheres of influence, which he wants to enforce in countries like Ukraine, Georgia, all the other Baltic states, and of course, not to mention the Middle East, like Afghanistan, and probably again in the case of Syria, or in Africa, like in the case of Libya or in the Sahel, or the other all the other places in the world where Putin has been behaving as a privateer. And this may be the reason why Trump is so reluctant to take action against Putin despite the growing pressure among Republicans in the Senate in that direction, because he likes the idea, Trump likes the idea of being the king of one sphere of influence, as Putin likes to play him just for the sake of his own interests. Of course, the winner in a world ruled by areas of influence will be Putin, not the United States, and not even China, much less Europe, and even much less the global south. If you consider how Putin conceives foreign policy and trade, Trump has the dollar zone, China has the yuan zone, but Putin can only share the yuan zone. Putin cannot trust again the West with the wealth he is siphoning from Russia and other places when the next election can be adverse to his interests. So he will have to share the yuan song. And the best way to do it is as a senior partner with a victory over Ukraine. That's why MERS and Europe in general mustn't wait for Trump when it comes to sanctions to Russia or about overhauling their defense procurement system. And the best simple symbol to convoke European voters around this idea is the ghost of Czechoslovakia 1938, as the parallels with the current crisis are undeniable. So voters must be aware that as much as they want peace, Neville Chamberlain also wanted peace in 1938, and because he refused to see reality, all what he got was the Second World War. Actually, Europe should involve China in the Ukrainian crisis, and the best way to create a bridge to China is especially the Trump's tariffs, that are creating uncertainty and bringing the shadows of a global recession that is going to affect negatively both Europe and China. So the idea of a trade deal in exchange for Xi Jinping cutting Putin's lifeline, which is the Russia's trade with China, could be appealing. And then the only matter that would remain was how China is going to help Putin to save face in Moscow, but that's not our business. So Europe must seek Merce's leadership, not Trump's. And what about Democrats? Democrats will have to rise to the occasion, rebuke Biden's foreign policy, and show they can be a reliable partner in 2029 if they win in 2028, of course. Otherwise, why should Merz or anybody else or Prime Minister Ichiba, as I mentioned before, take them into account as Merz plans to overhaul Germany's economy and Europe's defense, over hard to overcome obstacles in the short term? Why should they consider them a reliable partner if they risk coming up with another Biden who is going to celebrate Jake Sullivan's stupid ideas? So they must come up with a sound alternative, and they must do it now. In the case of China, take into account that this implies playing with fire, because as Xi Jinping is still struggling with the China's deflation, the risk of, in the best case, a mass devaluation of the yuan, or in the worst case of China entering the war at the side of Putin in order to revive the Chinese economy if he finds no other alternative, is also our problem. Imagine the seasoned Russian army, as it is right now, backed openly, not marginally, but openly by the Chinese economy and its resources. And the least we should do to face this risk is to push China towards Russia, especially when if China tries to solve its deflation with a military option. The target may be not Taiwan but Ukraine, supporting Russia as it's combining their armies that China has the best chances, because obviously it's not, a military option is not good if you don't have a reasonable chance at victory. And this would be added to the short-term effects this upheaval would have in supply chains that depend on Chinese exports, especially on products for which we don't have easy or enough substitutes. Let's disabuse ourselves about a ridiculous notion that if Trump plays tough, China is going to cave and say, yes, sir, yes, sir. No, China can't cave to Trump without losing all it has built in his long term project for the global south. So that's why China cannot cave, no matter what. That's not going to happen. Besides, ASEAN, ASEAN, and other Asian and even Latin American countries are seeking to form blocs to face the tide of Trump's tariffs and the financial uncertainty that could result if a financial crisis is unleashed as a consequence of his tariffs and fiscal irresponsibility. And how are those blocks like BRICS of ASEAN going to behave? Well, it's not very difficult to realize that they are going to side with China. And if Putin is a senior partner in that bloc, well, that's a recipe for disaster. So instead, of trying to downsize Putin to the level of Kim Jong-un in the Chinese yuan song, we would be elevating him even more as the king of one of the three spheres of influence, even though their economy is no that doesn't support that treatment, and even when out of the yuan song, Vladimir Putin is nothing. He cannot get back to the West. So, finally, let me comment some relevant articles from Foreign Affairs before ending this video. First is The Rise and Fall of Great Power Competition, written by Stacy E. Goddard, and from that I will take some extracts and make some comments. Trump's vision of the world is not one of great power competition, but of great power collusion, a concert system akin to the one that shaped Europe during the 19th century. Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, a real estate tycoon who has been heavily involved in the negotiations with Russia, mused about the possibilities of US Russian collaboration in an interview with the commentator Tucker Carlson. He said Chelsea lanes may be sent liquefied natural gas into Europe together, maybe collaborate on artificial intelligence together. Who doesn't want to see a world like that? Of course, and that's exactly what I have been saying about my fears about the mineral deal signed by Ukraine, because in this vision of the world, to make that profitable in terms of business, you have to the best scenario is the most likely the most feasible scenario is one in which you get rid of Zelensky and turn Ukraine into Belarus, which would means submitting Europe to Russian whims when it comes to energy. As the author mentions, um, this conception of the world implies demarcating spaces where where each great power has the right to practice unfettered expansion and domination. And if you, as I mentioned before, if you consider how Putin conceives foreign policy and trade in the cases of the Sahel, or now Afghanistan, then you may have a pretty good idea how that world would look like. Although Trump might think that spheres of influence would be easy to delineate and manage, they are not. At the Yalta Conference in 1945, Roosevelt, the Joseph Stalin, and Winston Churchill envisioned peaceful co-managing the post-World War II scenario. And I must add here that FDR came to this idea reluctantly, and the case of Poland is a case of sad memory, is the best example of that. He didn't let Poland fall under the Russian sphere until the last moment, because at the last moment he wanted a democratic future for Poland. Instead, these three powers, England, the United States, and Russia, soon found themselves battling at the boundaries of their respective spheres, first at the core of the New Order in Germany, and later at the spheres at the periphery, or in Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan. Yes, that is true, but it's also true that the Cold War mentality that started taking root with Truman, it got to the almost delirious levels with Eisenhower, were practically what derailed the FDR's efforts at creating a world order in which, yes, there would be spheres of influence, but also collaboration. Then she says, worse, even if spheres of influence were drawn with Latin America in the U.S. sphere and Eastern Europe in Russia's, where does that leave Africa, which is rich in rare earths and minerals, uh, and Europe and Asia, and why we should expect they are going to meekly accept that distribution, or ASEAN, ASEAN, or Brazil and India in BRIC are going to become vassals of China. So that is a very gratuitous assumption that is not based on reality if you consider the clashes between Brazil and India with Russia inside BRICS. And where does that leave Belt and Road? So it would have to be a very diminished version that contradicts China's ambitions in the global south, uh, which is not just a matter of markets, but a matter of resources, especially when consider, considering the uneven distribution of the minerals and rare earths we need for new green technologies. Then we have the article The Return of Spheres of Influence by Monica Duffy Toft. And there she says that Russian President Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine, the 22 the 2022 invasion, was never simply a regional conflict. His illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014 was the proof of concept for a broader Russian test of the so-called rules-based international order, probing how far the West would go to defend that order, which is a sad memory, but Jake Sullivan and Barack Obama, they did very little to show Putin that it was a bad idea to bet on imperialism. But anyway, in 1945, the phony elections in Poland are a sad memory of real politics. Even FDR couldn't escape. That's what I have mentioned before. On the other hand, today we see Trump encouraging Putin to stick to his maximalist pretensions. So there is a huge difference between FDR and Trump. For FDR, spheres of influence was something he reluctantly had to accept, while on the case of Trump, that's something he's encouraging. Unlike Yalta, where two democracies bargained with one autocracy, regime type no longer appears to hinder a sense of shared interest. Remember that to the end, FDR tried to persuade Stalin to let Poland to be a democracy. It is hard power. In this case, in Trump's case, it's hard power only, and a return to the ancient principle that the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. It would be the leitmotif in that world. That is a recipe for constant and permanent instability, of course, because nobody is going to be happy to with content itself with being a vassal, especially now that we have a strong blocks like ASEAN and BRICS and others that the good the fight the imperialist pretensions of Putin, for instance, and Trump if he joins him, because which is much less likely because the MAGA base is more for out some kind of autarky where they will be isolated from the world, they will create a white country, and somehow magically all the inputs they need to produce the goods and services would be available here in the United States. But in such a world, multilateral institutions not blocked, but the multilateral institutions such as NATO and the European Union would be sidelined and the autonomy of smaller nations threatened. And this is true, but when it comes to coalitions and organizations where interests are more explicit, are more relevant to all the parties like ASEAN and BRICS, that may be a bit different, even if they militarily could not be do enough to stop Putin's or Xi Jinping's or Trump's imperialistic ambitions. So, as mentioned, Yalta marked a decisive return to politics based on its spheres of influence, like in the 19th century, like before World War One, but only because the participating democracies tolerated it as a necessary but hopefully short-lived evil, because they accepted it as the best available means to prevent another catastrophic world war. On the other hand, you don't need spheres of influence to assert national interests. In our case, the United States national interest. In the second half of the 20th century, the ability to shape global narratives through soft power has become almost as vital as military power. The United States has exerted influence through its dominant in popular culture, provisions of foreign aid, which are under attack with Trump, and higher education, which also is also under attack by Trump, and investments in overseas initiatives such as the Peace Corps and democratization efforts, which are also under attack by Trump. Now, more recently, beginning with the assault on Georgia in 2008, which has created an independent satellite state inside at the site of Georgia, the same way they did in 2014 in Ukraine. Russia has relied on hybrid warfare and the use of proxy armed force, efforts that escalated with the illegal annexation of Crimea and culminated in the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Although major powers have attempted to use force to get their way throughout the past few decades, their attempts have consistently backfired and failed to prove that force is an effective tool for advancing national interests. There is even a very interesting article by Paul Krugman where he shows why major powers stop betting on colonialism and prefer to bet on trade, which is very pertinent to this point. The U.S. military's intervention in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya were all costly failures, and Russia's military efforts on behalf of the Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad failed, as well as its incursion into Ukraine is faltering. What brings us to another important difference with the 19th century, which is that in the 19th century, it was easier to delineate and to respect geographically coherent spheres of influence in a less globalized world dependent on the steel and oil. Today, the critical resources that large power need are spread out across the world, the globe, and very unevenly, I must say, in the case of rare earth, for instance. Taiwan is a particularly flashpoint because the chips it produces are critical to to many countries' growth and national security. The United States cannot afford to let China dominate access to those chips. Neither does the United States want to permit Russia sole access to Ukraine's rare earths and other minerals. So all this complicates the drawing of lines among big powers that was easier to make in the 19th century. And besides that, you have the cases of alliances. Japan and Taiwan has been within, let's say, a USA sphere of influence, even though they neighbor China. Would China accept Japan as part of an American sphere of influence? So, in a globalized world, that could be a recipe for a series of proxy wars that would make the world more unstable. And finally, in this article, I have a disagreement when it comes to the idea of some trying to isolate China and bring back Putin to the West. The problem with that scenario where the US and Russia unite against China is that both Xi and Putin know that a MAGA candidate might not succeed Trump in 2029, what would pull the rug under this scenario because let's admit it, Putin is a terrible person, but he's not stupid. If Democrats come back to power in 2029, where would that leave Putin if he shows that he is willing to betray Xi Jinping at the first opportunity? Then we have another article, this Europe needs a new way to cooperate by Sophia Besch and Richard Jones. And yes, this article has some interesting ideas when it's proposing a new system parallel to the European Union in which different clusters of European states can cooperate on select areas of policy, uh, which what would cut through many of the bloc's current bureaucratic and ideological roadblocks, especially when those bureaucratic barriers are manipulated by people like Orban, who has been championing Russian interests against the European interests without significant repercussions. Let's consider that the European Union institutions are designed to be slow. They favor technocratic management over disruptive change. The bureaucratic inertia and legal complexity blocks bold action. As a result, the much criticized status quo endures or is manipulated against the European interest. But then, what are you going to do if the European Union and NATO agreements clash with those of the new system? My answer, which I'm going to agree, the author is going to agree later, is that we would have to prefer the new system, of course. because the new system, the old system, the current system is solving. No, we have urgent problems, very that could make a huge difference in the future of Europe and the world, and we cannot let them up to the slow reactions of an organization that, in its ambition of including many countries, have got, got trapped between conflicting interests. What the author criticizes about these coalitions like Macron's and Starmer coalition of the willing formed to address the Ukrainian issue is that after pushback from excluded states, the coalition was rapidly expanded to include 31 countries. As a result, it now includes several members that are either unwilling or unable to contribute significantly, yet you cannot, yet the solution for this problem, as I see, is that you have to set clear guidelines oriented to the purpose of the coalition. For instance, the role in the overhaul of the European defense system. So they cannot decide about those guidelines. They must take them or not join the coalition in the otherwise. So that would mean that would help excluding those that prefer petty local interests to the common security. Because otherwise you could be admitting a lot of Trojan horses that would turn you into a copy of the current NATO, and what good is your coalition of the willing then? It would solve as much as NATO is solving, nothing. If so, these coalitions could be the way out of obstruction, dithering, and stagnation, which has characterized past attempts of Europe to improve their common defense. They have to be goal oriented, and yes, that would imply smaller numbers in case deployment is needed, but their effectiveness may lead to overlapping deals with NATO on specific issues like this, and so increase the possibility of addressing this the deployment issue. And if not, well, it's much better for you to deal with a smaller army that is determined to address the issue than to with 31 countries that are in your coalition, all of them unwilling to send troops or even to make the necessary investments, or even blocking the necessary investments you want to make, for instance, in Germany, because they want to cut on issues on which they cannot even afford decent investment. These coalitions can be seen as club memberships, and admittance to it must depend on the guidelines, and the guidelines must assign a role directed by the purpose of the coalition. In case of consolidation of the defense industry, excluded countries would have no say in the decisions and would have to suffer the consequences alone. For instance, Hungary and Slovakia, if Slovakia wants to join Hungary. But you cannot allow these countries to come and then decide to change the guidelines. The guidelines are what they are, and if you don't like them, stay away. Because when you have Putin making 3 million artillery shells this year, and according to one report I have, the European Union is struggling to to produce 1 million, then you must have a sense of urgency, and you cannot tailor that urgency to the whims and a caprice of states that are joining just for the sake of joining or for the sake of sabotaging your effort. True, NATO doesn't function without the United States and European Union members. European Union member states do not fully trust their institutions in Brussels or one another. But a more flexible coalition, even if they fail to push the European Union and NATO in the right direction, may take action when action is needed, even if that excludes many other European Union or NATO states. And due to Putin's aggression, time is of the essence. And if the European Union and NATO become empty shells and must be replaced with smaller but functional pacts, so be it. A weak Europe will only encourage countries like Slovakia to follow the path of Georgia, while looking weak on issues like Ukraine. And the author proposes an innovative institutional structure in which different clusters of states participate to varying degrees across all areas of policy. She says that unlike ad hoc coalitions of the willing, this model would be anchored by an institutional core. I believe these coalitions should converge to an institutional core, yes, and that this institutional core should replace the current institutional framework of the European Union and NATO if that's necessary. But the core of this institutional core for this institutional framework should be guidelines that demand specific commitments dictated by the goals of each coalition. We cannot let each newcomer to propose changes to just to dilute the efforts to achieve the goal. Thus, the priority is the goal. And if the coalitions still can converge to an institutional core, so be it. But the goal should not be sacrificed under any circumstances. Also, clear guidelines would make less likely voting obstructionists, as we have seen in the case of Orban. Then we have another article by Lin Kwok, which is an author. The article is how Trump's coercion could backfire in Asia. And Lin Kwok is an author I have mentioned before when mentioning how in 2024 the preference between among ASEAN, ASEAN, change in favor of China, and the most recent poll has shown a return to the United States. That poll was taken before April 2, Liberation Day, the tariff date, so that may change back to China again. Anyway, as she says, Asian countries have long feared being forced to choose between the United States and China in recent years, although Washington has pressed its allies and partners to break with Beijing on specific issues. Asia has largely tolerated hedging between the two superpowers without consequences, which is good. Allies and partners were free to maintain wide-ranging ties with China while benefiting from the US security umbrella. As long as these Asian countries work as bridges between the United States and China, it could be even positive as a way to establish ways of cooperation. Thus, for example, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan all try to rely on the United States when it comes to security. And yet, all those three countries count China as their largest trading partner. Not just that, more recently, they have presented a common front against Trump's tariffs. And let's not forget that that Asian economies are too integrated. So Trump's bullying and unpredictability will destabilize not only China but will also affect other countries and allies uh, like Japan and South Korea, not to mention the case of Vietnam and others. In Southeast East Asia, the region values U.S. security engagement, and the United States is its largest source of foreign direct investment. But let's not forget that most of that American capital is concentrated in a single country, Singapore, while China is still their largest trading partner. Besides, Muslim members of ASEAN have been alienated by Biden's pro Netanyahu policy and the perceived weakness of the Biden administration. As we have mentioned in another video, when it comes to the ICEA survey from 2024, in 2025, the US recovered the lead, but narrowly, basically due to aggressive Chinese behavior in the South China Sea. Yet, as mentioned before, the poll was taken before April 2, Tariff Day. The chief appeared to reflect this chief in favor of the United States appeared to reflect the lead's frustration with China's assertiveness in the South China Sea, not a deeper reorientation towards the United States. Washington continues to face structural weaknesses in the region, especially in the economic realm, where U.S. initiatives still lag behind China's in both scale and delivery. Across Southeast Asia, China significantly outpaces the United States in trade, multilateral economic initiatives, and infrastructure. Since 2013, China's Belt and Road Initiative has delivered major projects. Meanwhile, a slew of US-led initiatives have yet to yield tangible results. So beyond coercion, rather than forcing allies and partners to cut ties with China, Trump may instead abandon them altogether by striking a great bargain with China that divides the world into spheres of influence, or by reaching a sweeping economic deal with him. Although often seen as distinct paths, coercion and abandonment could be pursued in parallel. This combination could pose the gravest risk for the region under pressure to choose between the United States and China, while simultaneously questioning whether Washington would stand by them if they needed so. Besides, Trump abandoning Europe and Ukraine despite previous commitments, or his harsher treatment given to allies than to the one given to foes, only add to that uncertainty. And let's remember that, different from the 19th century, these blocks may present a fierce resistance to be included in an area sphere of influence. So what makes the situation precarious at best, and could invite the participation of the frictions between areas of influence that could lead in proxy wars proxy wars like during the Cold War. Without its allies and partners, U.S. leadership in Asia and around the world will erode. This will not make America great again. It will leave it weaker abroad and poorer at home. So, on that, I completely agree with the author. And that brings me again to the most important question, which is what is the foreign policy, what is the alternative on foreign policy the Democratic Party is going to propose, because it cannot be Biden's foreign policy that only pave the ground for Trump. It must be a return to the rules-based system pushed by FDR as imperfectly as he did because of the ambitions of both the United Kingdom and Russia, but it must go in that direction. And considering the parallels we can make between Putin and Hitler, how their economies are addicted to war, the thuggish way in which they have taken over the respective governments, um, we have to go towards a policy that consists in isolating Putin and getting into a deal, a new base system order with China. That way, the militaristic options would be sidelined, and Putin would be reduced to the level of another Kim Jong-un. Otherwise, we are just inviting disaster, and as I said at the start of this article, unfortunately, Putin is playing with Trump's naive ambitions about Greenland, about Panama, and Democrats are not opening their mouths. And among civil society, there are articles that are interesting, like the ones I have commented, but let's admit it, most voters don't read foreign affairs. So, what is the civil society doing to frame foreign policy in terms of the American interest and not in terms of the idiocy of mediocre advisors like Jake Sullivan? If not, if the civil society keeps trying to keep their powder dry, they may end up realizing that their only option is capitulation, and then, well, it doesn't matter if their powder is dry or wet. Because they have already lost. What points of reference could you use? Hungary. I have said it many times. And having said that, let me leave you with our newscast.
Good evening. This is Brian Thomas Simons, and these are the main headlines of this hour. Among other news,
more than 2,000 Starbucks baristas go on strike to protest new dress code that doesn't reflect their identities in present list of demands. More than 2,000 baristas from 120 Starbucks unionized stores have gone on strike to protest the new dress code. Asked about how a dress code affects them, a union representative from Starbucks Workers United from Hanover, Maryland, declared that our clothes represent our identities. It's about representation and identity. You know, it's as when you are not asked your pronouns. No, so not cool. The union representative, who preferred to keep his name off the record, also announced a list of 266 demands they have presented to Starbucks's headquarters. Among them, A. Clients will be required to ask the baristas pronouns. Pronouns are important. B. Starbucks will hire Latinx subcontractors to clean the bathrooms. It's demeaning for a barista to clean bathrooms. So not cool. C. A rate hour no lower than $40 indexed to inflation. Buying on the internet is so tempting and cool that a $20.25 rate is too Latinx. D. Wall decorations will be replaced with pride flags. So many flags and so many prides: Latinx pride, African American pride, LGBTQ+ pride. After all, how are we going to make the world better without pride flags and pride parades? Elon Musk disappointed Trump didn't end Medicaid and Medicare to pay for Golden Dome. Rich treated unfairly in this country, billionaire says. In a recent interview conceded to CBS Sunday Morning, Elon Musk confirmed he was stepping down from his duties at Doge. He also declared his disappointment because Trump didn't end Medicaid and Medicare to pay for Golden Dome. Golden Dome is a contract that we have tailored for SpaceX to win, President Trump and me. But it's going to be very difficult to justify as additional debt unless we cut waste and fraud, in other words, Medicaid, Medicare, and maybe even Social Security. Billionaires are treated very unfairly in this country. Asked whether he contemplated getting back to politics, Musk laconically answered, maybe. Naked man arrested at church thrift store returned to Reverend as not eligible for Patriot defense for not joining the Republican Party, deputies say. Michael Da Costa, 38, was arrested in Ocala, Marion County, Florida, after barging into a church thrift shop and stealing a t-shirt. Da Costa tried to invoke the Patriot defense by saying that it was his sincerely held belief that he was dressed at the moment of the incident and that the t-shirt was his. But deputies off the record dismissed Da Costa's claim, saying that for the Patriot defense to work, the defendant has to invoke the sincere belief exemption but also join the Republican Party before or soon after receiving legal counsel, which Da Costa has failed to do. Besides, he kept saying that Reverend Cruz, from Wings of Faith, the church, had kidnapped him with sexual intentions, but that doesn't fit with the Patriot defense. So most probably the judge will return him to the custody of Reverend Cruz with a suspended sentence. Da Costa was transported to the Marion County Jail, where he remains on $6,000 bond. A third charge was added for a probation violation of a domestic violence injunction, arrest records show. Florida man finds Jesus during DUI traffic stop, receives $100,000 compensation. Theodore John Evans, 51, was arrested in Tampa, Florida, during a DUI stop. The Monroe County Sheriff's Office declared that after processing the defendant, Evans' lawyer announced to them that Evans had not been intoxicated but that his dangerous driving had been caused by seizures that originated in Evans accepting Jesus as his Lord and Savior while driving. He also announced that Evans was already a member of the Florida Republican Party, which qualified him for the Patriot defense, just like the January 6 rioters, and so made him eligible for a $100,000 compensation since the Patriot defense turned his arrest illegal. It's difficult to catch up with the law and all, but if our President Trump says so, I guess it's right, declared the Monroe County Sheriff's Office.
This has been the news of this hour. Sponsored by Church of the Holy Redeemer's Power in the Spirit. Have you accepted Jesus Christ as your personal Savior? Did you vote for Trump in 2016 and then in 2020? This is the right church for you. If so, Church of the Holy Redeemer's Power in the Spirit is the only Christian church that can promise you in the Lord to have 72 virgins in heaven for only a donation of $50 a month. You will have access to those 72 virgins in heaven. For an additional $25, you will be allowed to replace 10 of them, and for $100, Heaven Premium, you will be allowed to choose them for yourself. Guaranteed, if you're not satisfied with those 72 virgins after you die, full refund of your money. We accept Visa, MasterCard, American Express, and Discover.